There is a man in this world whose name alone makes mothers pull their children close and look away. And inside that man's body, something entirely new has just woken up.
His name was Daniel Shinn, 34 years old, agricultural engineer, 10 years of fieldwork in the worst humanitarian disasters on Earth.
South Sudan, Yemen, Nepal, Somalia, places where the ground itself seemed to have given up on human life. He was on a plane over the Pacific when the storm hit, when the darkness came, when everything stopped. And then he opened his eyes to blackened oak beams and the reek of sour wine. His body wouldn't obey. He raised his hands and froze. White hands, soft hands, gold rings on every finger. Not his hands. He rode to the side and saw her, a girl on the floor, about 20 years old, eyes open, empty, dark marks on her neck. Dead. Daniel jerked back so hard he fell off the bed onto stone, and then the flood came. Someone else's memories pouring into his skull like filth through a broken dam. Feasts where wine was poured over servants' heads, girls dragged into the cellar, a child, maybe 6 years old, a whip, a scream. Public executions, a crowd silent with fear, and laughter. His own laughter. No, not his. Cassian's. Duke Cassian von Mournhold, one of the most hated men in the kingdom. Daniel clutched his temples and did the only thing a man trained to assess disasters could do. He assessed. He had seen things like this before. Warlords in Darfur, camp commanders in South Sudan. The same pattern. Power without conscience, exercised on people with no choice. Only now, he was inside one of them. He stood up. His legs shook. Cassian's body was wrecked, liver swollen, muscles soft, hands that had never touched anything heavier than a cup. He walked to the mirror, and a pale man of about 25 stared back, handsome in that hollow, unhealthy way. Thousands hated this face. Daniel looked at it and made a decision. He covered the dead girl with Cassian's embroidered cloak. Then he walked to the window and opened the shutters. What he saw outside was worse than anything in the memories. The earth was black, not dark, not dry, dead. A cracked wasteland stretching to the horizon without a single patch of green. Children with swollen bellies pressed against the gate below. A woman sat by the wall, not crying, not calling out, just staring at the sky. Daniel had seen that posture before, at the Daub camp in Somalia. When a person stops waiting, they stop crying. He knew what those swollen bellies meant. Kwashiorkor, protein energy malnutrition. These children were dying, right now, just slowly. He opened the door. In the hallway, a guard went pale and stiff. Everyone here was afraid of Cassian's face. Daniel walked past them all without a word. He went down to the hall. Officers fell silent. Captain Halvar, bull-necked and sharp-eyed, asked where his lordship was headed. Daniel didn't answer. He stepped outside onto the porch. 50 people at the gate. Peasants who came every morning. From the memories he knew why. Cassian used to throw moldy bread and laughed while they fought over it. Guards were already moving toward the gate with whips. Daniel said one word. Stop. His voice was hoarse and unfamiliar, but the guards froze. They were trained to obey that voice. He walked down to the gate. The crowd recoiled. Mothers grabbed their children. An old man fell to his knees. He had seen that fear before, in Darfur, when armed men rode into the camp. Only now, he was the one they feared. He ordered them to bring him the sickest child. A woman was pushed forward, holding a girl of about 5. Gray skin, sunken eyes. Daniel took the girl. The mother cried out. A guard raised his arm. Daniel told him not to touch her. The girl was light, far too light. 3rd-degree dehydration.
Without help, she had about 6 hours. He carried her into the castle and went straight to the kitchen. Leftovers from breakfast covered the table. Roasted game, fresh bread, fruit, enough to feed a dozen children for a week. He set the girl down on the table, swept the dishes aside, and asked for clean water. The cook didn't understand the question. Daniel took one look at the courtyard and knew why. The well sat 10 steps from the stable drain. Classic. He had seen this in every refugee camp he'd ever worked in. He ordered them to fetch water and boil it. The cook looked at him like he'd lost his mind. While the water heated, Daniel examined the girl. Pulse rapid and weak. Skin that didn't spring back when pinched. The so-called gray fever that all of Mournhold feared was nothing more than dysentery. Dirty water. Filth in the wells. The children weren't dying from a curse. They were dying from filth. The water boiled. He let it cool. He found salt and honey and stirred a careful pinch of each into a mug of warm water. Oral rehydration, the simplest method in the world. Salt to restore electrolytes, sugar to help the intestines absorb water. It had saved millions of children in his world. Here, no one had ever heard of it. He fed the girl a spoonful at a time, every 2 minutes. The mother stood frozen in the doorway. Halvar stood behind her. Neither breathed. 1 hour passed. The girl swallowed. 2 hours. The grayish tint began to fade from her skin. 3 hours. Daniel didn't leave the table. A spoonful? Water. A spoonful? Water. By evening, the girl opened her eyes. She looked at Cassian's face and didn't scream. She licked her lips and asked for more. He gave her another spoonful. His hand didn't tremble. The mother made a sound then. Not a scream, not a word. Something that came from deeper than words. The sound a person makes when they realize their child will not die. Daniel had heard that sound in a field hospital in Nepal when they pulled a living boy from the rubble. It was the same in every world. He stepped out onto the porch. The crowd was still there. They had been standing all day. He told them the girl was alive. No one moved. No one believed him. The Duke of Mournhold did not save children. It didn't fit into any worldview they had ever known. By dawn, there were already 100 people at the gate. Mothers with children. Gray faces, same symptoms, same dirty water. The word had traveled faster than he expected. Daniel ordered 3 cauldrons set up in the courtyard. Boil water continuously. Every mother receives a mug of solution. Salt, honey, boiled water. A spoonful every 2 minutes. Halvar stood nearby, watching every movement with sharp, unreadable eyes. He didn't understand what was happening, but he could see that the children had stopped dying. The second day. The third. Daniel didn't sleep. Smoke from the fires rose above the castle like a signal across the black land. People came from distant villages, 20 miles across the dead earth, carrying children in their arms. By the end of the 4th day, not a single child had died in Mournhold. Not one. Daniel sat on the courtyard steps. All around him, mothers fed their children from mugs. Someone lit a fire. Someone began quietly singing. He looked at his hands, white, slender, with calluses scraped off from hundreds of spoonfuls. These were a monster's hands. He would heal with them anyway. On the 5th day, he fell asleep on the porch steps, face resting on his arm, too exhausted to find a bed. He woke to heavy breathing above him. Halvar, looking down with something between anger and concern. The Castellan and chief tax collector were waiting in the council chamber. The duchy's affairs could not wait. The treasury was empty. 3 days of boiling water and distributing honey and salt had cost the castle as much as the peasants usually paid in a month of taxes. Daniel stood up, every muscle aching, and went to face them. 2 men sat at the long table. Castellan Rudger, elderly, gaunt, fingers like a ledger keeper, 30 years of managing this castle's affairs. He knew every coin. Beside him sat the chief tax collector, Fagrin, fat, sweaty, with oily eyes and the look of a man who had grown comfortable taking things from people who couldn't stop him. Daniel sat at the head of the table and listened to the figures. Mournhold owed the crown 3 years of back taxes. The treasury was nearly empty. Of 32 villages, only 7 paid regularly. The rest were deserted or too broken to contribute anything. Half the arable land yielded nothing. Livestock dying. Artisans fled. The only income came from timber sales and the fines Fagrin extracted for any offense he could name. Daniel listened and ran the numbers in his head. He had rebuilt a region in South Sudan where war had raged for 2 years. No money, no infrastructure, no skilled workers, just devastated land and desperate people. He had managed then. He would manage now. He asked one question. How many people live in Mournhold? Rudger paused. The last census said 6,000, but that was 3 years ago. Maybe 4,000 remain now. Maybe 3.5. No one had counted. Daniel said the first thing they would do was a real census. Every person, name, age, location, ailments, skills. Rudger looked at him as if he had gone mad. Why? Daniel said, you cannot help people whose names you don't know.
Fagrin snorted. He had no need to know the names of livestock. How many heads, how much is owed, that was enough.
Daniel looked at Fagrin for a long moment in silence. Fagrin turned pale. He was used to Cassian's other look, drunken, cruel. This look was different. Calm, cold. The look of a man who had seen things far more terrifying than a fat tax collector. Daniel announced that as of today, the collection of fines would cease, taxes cut in half, flogging for non-payment abolished. Fagrin jumped to his feet, face red, shouting that this was madness, that the treasury would collapse, that the peasants would grow insolent, that there would be nothing left to pay the guards. Daniel let him finish. Then he told Fagrin he was relieved of his duties, effective immediately. Fagrin shouted louder. He made threats. He would write to the capital. He would say Cassian had gone mad. He would call it treason. Halvar stood by the door, waiting. Daniel nodded. Halvar grabbed Fagrin by the collar and led him out of the hall. Silence settled over the room. Rutger folded his hands on the table, watching Daniel with calculating curiosity.
Daniel told him that right now the peasants of Mournhold couldn't pay. They were dying. The dead pay nothing at all. The living and well-fed will pay 3 times as much in 6 months as the dead do in a lifetime.
This wasn't mercy, he said. It was arithmetic. Rudger was silent for a moment, then gave one short, curt nod. The water problem came next. All the wells in the castle and nearby villages were contaminated. That much was obvious.
Rudger named a mountain stream, 2 hours' ride to the north, that had once fed the castle through an old aqueduct. The aqueduct had collapsed 20 years ago. No one had repaired it.
Daniel said he needed workers. Rudger said there were none. Able-bodied men were either in the guard, on the run, or too weak from hunger to stand. Daniel said he would pay with food. He would open the castle's stores. Cassian had hoarded grain, salted meat, and dried fruit in the cellars, not out of foresight, but out of greed. Either way, the supplies were there. He announced that anyone working on the aqueduct would receive 2 bowls of porridge a day, hot, from the castle's own supplies. 40 people showed up on the first day, men and women. Some could barely stand. Daniel organized shifts. The weak carried clay and mixed mortar. The strong worked the stone. He worked alongside all of them. By the second day, Cassian's soft hands were covered in new calluses. The skin cracked and bled. Daniel wrapped his palms in rags and carried on. The guards watched in silence, a duke hauling stones. None of them had ever seen anything like it. Halvar came to him on the 3rd day and said it was improper. A duke shouldn't work with his hands. People would think he was weak. Daniel replied that people would think he was hungry, just like them. Halvar didn't understand. Daniel didn't explain. Before the aqueduct work began, he had needed someone who could keep records. Rudger mentioned a refugee girl who had arrived a month earlier. young, literate, working in the kitchen for food. Half an hour later, a girl of about 19 stood in the office doorway. Small, neat, worn dress. Rock crystal lenses on thin frames sat on her nose. A rarity, expensive, the only thing she still had.
Her name was Sora Khan.
Daniel asked if she could count. She said she could. He asked if she knew what a census was. She said her father kept ledgers, and she had been helping him since she was 12.
He laid his plan before her. She read it. Then she looked up and said that item 3 should come before item 2. No point counting people if you don't know what to feed them.
Supplies first, then census.
Daniel looked at her. She was absolutely right. He told her she was hired.
Sora asked what the position was. Daniel said for now it was the position of the only sane person in this castle.
Sora didn't smile. She nodded, took the plan, and went to work.
By evening, she returned with a full inventory. Every sack of grain, every barrel of salted meat, every pot of honey, all counted, described, and compiled into a table. For the first time in 5 days, Daniel wasn't alone. Something inside him eased. Sora spent 10 days going from village to village with 2 guards, sent not to intimidate, but to protect her on the roads.
The peasants hid when they saw people from the castle. 3 years of Fagrin's collectors had taught them that a visit from the castle meant one thing: take the last of what you have.
Sora would sit by the well and wait, sometimes for hours. Then someone would come out, the hungriest, the most desperate. She would ask for their name, write it down, ask how many people in the family, if anyone was sick, if there were children, what they could do with their hands. She took nothing. She left a small bag of salt and a pot of honey from the castle supplies. She explained how to prepare the solution for the sick. By the 3rd day, in some villages they were already waiting for her. By the 5th, they were telling the truth. By the 10th, they were asking her to stay longer. She came back with 3 notebooks filled with small, neat handwriting. 3,241 people. That was how many remained in Mournhold. Of those, 763 were children under 12. 211 had gray fever. Of those, 127 were in critical condition, and all the critical cases were children. 3,000 people in a territory where 15,000 had once lived. 12,000 had died or fled during 3 years of Cassian's rule and the Grey Drought. Daniel sat with those numbers for a long time. Then he put the notebooks down and got to work. The aqueduct repair took 7 days. On the 8th, the water flowed. Clear mountain water gushed through old stone gutters and struck the castle reservoir with a sound like something coming back to life. Daniel stood by the reservoir and watched. Sora stood nearby recording the flow rate. Workers lined the edge. A woman cupped her hands and drank straight from the stream, not from a dirty bucket, not from a stinking well. Clean water, cold from the mountains. She drank and tears streamed down her face. Or was it water? Daniel decided it didn't matter. Now came the land. Castle supplies would last 2 months, but 2 months would pass quickly. The real solution was the soil. Daniel went out into the fields the day after the aqueduct started working, shovel in hand. He dug in different places. He examined the color, the structure. He smelled it, crumbled it between his fingers, while Sora followed behind him and wrote down everything he said. The topsoil had baked into a dead crust. Beneath it, dry clay, no organic matter, not a single worm, not a single root. But 2 shovel lengths deeper, he found what he was looking for, a moist layer, dark, with traces of life. The soil wasn't dead all the way through. It was just trapped under a crust it couldn't break. Daniel held a clump of that deep soil in his palm and felt it. Living soil. He knew exactly what to do. Green manure. Plants that don't produce a harvest but restore the earth. Nitrogen-fixing crops that take from the air and give back to the ground. He asked Sora if she knew what beans were. She looked at him strangely and said, of course, beans and peas are food for the poor. No one plants them on purpose. Daniel asked if anyone in the villages had seeds. Sora said old Beatrice in the village of Calmer had a sack of dried peas hidden under the floor. He sent for them that day. He paid double, a sack of grain for a sack of peas. Beatrice thought it was a trap. Then she thought the Duke had gone mad. Then she handed over the peas and clutched the grain to her chest so hard no one could have pried it away.
Daniel divided the peas into portions. He plowed 3 small plots near the castle walls, personally, with hands already raw from the aqueduct work.
He planted them not for food, but for the soil. In 2 months, he told Sora, these plants would need to be mowed down and buried back in the ground. Not harvested, buried.
Sora wrote it down. She looked at him and asked why. He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't explain nitrogen fixation and nodule bacteria in a medieval world that had no framework for it. He said the plants draw the power of the sky and give it back to the earth. Ancient wisdom from an old book in Cassian's library.
Sora looked at him for a long time. She clearly didn't believe a single word. She wrote it down anyway. The third front was sanitation, the hardest one, harder than the aqueduct, harder than the land, because here, habits had to change.
Daniel gathered the 40 aqueduct workers in the courtyard and told them a simple thing. Filth kills. Filth in the water kills children. Flies on food kill children. Hands that touched manure and then touched bread kill children. Gray fever is not a punishment from the stars. It is dirty water. The crowd listened in silence. He could see on their faces that they didn't believe him. Their ancestors had drunk from wells near stables for 3,000 years. Daniel didn't argue. He demonstrated. 2 bowls, one from the old well, one of boiled water from the aqueduct, set in the sun for a day. By evening, the first had turned green and stank. The second remained clear. He held both up for the crowd to see.
Which one do you want to give your children? He asked. No one answered.
But the next day, 3 families came asking for boiled water. A week later, 19. He ordered latrines built 100 paces from the wells, wooden platforms, lids, filled the old pits that sat next to water sources. He taught them to make soap from ash and fat. Ash, water, boiled and strained, fat added and boiled again. Rough, caustic, but it cleaned your hands. That was when he found Evelyn Carr. A tall, red-haired woman with scars on her back, living alone in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the nearest village. The peasants went to her in secret when they were sick, but were afraid to be seen near her. Cassian had flogged her publicly a year before for witchcraft. Anyone seen near her house was fined. Daniel went to her himself. He knocked. Evelyn opened the door, saw Cassian's face, and didn't flinch. She just stood there looking, wearing the expression of someone who had nothing left to lose. He said he needed a healer. He was lifting the ban on folk medicine. He wanted to open a clinic in the castle and wanted her to run it. Evelyn asked what kind of game this was. Danielle said it wasn't a game. She said why she should trust a man who had flogged her in front of the whole village. Daniel said she didn't have to trust him, but the children were sick, and he wasn't a doctor. She was, and the children were sick. He repeated it, because he had no more compelling argument than that. Evelyn looked at him for another minute. Then she said fine, but if it was a trap, she'd slit his throat in his sleep. Daniel said that was fair. She arrived at the castle the next day. He gave her 3 rooms in the south wing. She assessed them, snorted, and said she needed beds, rags, water, pots, knives, and herbs. He gave her everything. She set up a makeshift clinic in 2 days, swearing like a field surgeon the entire time, at guards who mixed up wound rags with floor rags, at the cook who brought unwashed bowls for patients. But when they brought her a child with a fever, she took that child in her arms, and the child went still. Her hands healed. Anyone who saw it knew. Daniel showed her the rehydration solution, the proportions. She listened closely, then asked how he knew this. He said he read it in an old book. Evelyn looked at him and said that in 20 years of medicine, she had never come across a single useful book on the subject, but the recipe worked. She didn't press him. She was the kind of person interested in results, not explanations. On the 10th day, something Daniel hadn't expected happened. Lion found him in the courtyard.
Lion, Cassian's half-sister, the illegitimate daughter of the former duke and a servant woman. Her mother had died from Cassian's beatings 2 years ago.
She had been living in the castle as a servant, with a knife always hidden in her sleeve and hatred in her eyes, sharp enough to cut stone.
She stopped 2 steps away and told him she had been walking through the villages alone, without guards.
She had seen wells with covers, latrines, women boiling water, washing their hands, children drinking the solution and not dying.
The hatred in her eyes hadn't left, but something else had moved in beside it, something she didn't know what to do with.
She said she would help with the census. Then she turned and walked away. Daniel watched her go. He didn't smile. He didn't say thank you. He knew it would ruin the moment.
He just nodded at her back.
By the end of the 3rd week, Daniel realized he was dying, not figuratively.
Cassian's body was failing. His liver ached constantly. Not the dull throb from before, but sharp, shooting pains. His hands shook in the mornings. He woke in the night soaked in sweat and unable to breathe.
Cassian's body had been fed daily doses of wine and opiates for years. Now it was demanding them back.
Withdrawal. Daniel knew exactly what that was. He had seen it in field commanders captured and held without drugs. The first 2 weeks were the most dangerous.
He had gotten through them on his feet through sheer work and stubbornness, but the body wouldn't let it go.
On the 21st day, his legs simply gave out in the middle of the yard, face first into the mud.
A guard helped him up. Daniel stood, but the world spun. His skin had gone gray, like the children he'd been treating. Evelyn examined him that evening. His liver was enlarged. She said he needed rest. Bed rest, clean water, light food, no physical labor. At least a month. Better 2. Daniel asked if he had 2 months. Evelyn said then he wouldn't have a body, one or the other. He lay in the bedroom staring at the ceiling. Same room, same black oak beams, and ran the numbers in his head instead of sleeping. The aqueduct worked. The clinic worked. Sora was keeping records. Evelyn was treating patients. 23 children from the critical list had moved to stable condition.
4 had died. He remembered their names. Elsa, Thomas Jr., Marin, a boy everyone called Redhead, whose real name no one knew. Sora had recorded him as Redhead and put a dash beside it.
4 out of 127. In his world, that would be called a triumph. Here, 4 children had been sewn into canvas and buried on the hill behind the castle. Daniel lay there thinking about Redhead, who didn't even have a name. Then he got up. Evelyn had told him to stay in bed. He went to a study instead. You can still use your head when you're sick. An hour later, Sora knocked and came in with new figures. Food consumption, remaining supplies, consumption rate. Daniel looked at the numbers and saw the problem immediately.
6 weeks of supplies remained, not 2 months as he had calculated, because more people were coming now, refugees, drawn by rumors that the Duke was feeding and treating people.
5 new families a day, sometimes 10, sometimes 20. Dirty, hungry, sick, with children in their arms.
Sora asked what to do. Daniel recognized the trap. In his world, it was called a capacity crisis, when a humanitarian mission attracts more people than it can serve.
The first instinct was always to close the gates, save resources for your own. That instinct had killed more people than any epidemic.
He opened his eyes and said the gates would remain open. Every new person would be counted and examined. The sick go to the clinic. The healthy go to work. Everyone who works eats. Those who can't work eat too, but portions shrink for everyone, including him.
Sora wrote it down. She asked what would happen in 6 weeks when the supplies ran out. Daniel said in 6 weeks the peas in the test plots would sprout. If the soil responded, they would have time to plant winter crops before the first frosts.
Sora asked what if the soil didn't respond.
Daniel said that he would go to the neighbors and borrow, take, cheat if he had to. He would not let people starve to death.
Sora was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly that he didn't seem like Cassian.
Daniel said he was Cassian, just a different one.
Sora left. Daniel sat alone and thought about 6 weeks, and about a girl named Kathleen.
The census had recorded her, Kathleen, 17 years old, daughter of blacksmith Brennan Ray, running the smithy alone while her father drank himself to pieces after her mother's death.
Minor repairs, horseshoes, nails, knives, keeping the forge alive with burned forearms and no one to help her. Daniel went to the smithy the next morning, despite Evelyn's instructions.
Kathleen looked up and froze at the sight of Cassian's face. Fear, yes, but underneath it, curiosity. A flicker that didn't belong to fear at all.
Daniel said he had a commission, a big one, well paid. He needed a water hammer.
She didn't know what that was. He took out the parchment he had been drawing on the night before. A wheel in a stream turns a shaft. The shaft lifts a heavy hammer. The hammer falls. It rises and falls again, endlessly, as long as the water flows.
One wheel replacing 10 blacksmiths.
Kathleen traced the drawing with her finger, and the look on her face changed entirely. She began asking questions, precise ones, mechanical ones.
What was the wheel's diameter? How much should the hammer weigh? Oak or ash for the shaft? Where to set the axle?
With every answer, her eyes lit up further. She didn't just understand the mechanics, she saw the possibilities.
If this works for forging, it works for milling, for sawing, for anything that needs power. Daniel looked at her and thought, in his world, this girl would be an engineer.
Here she stood in a smoky smithy with burns on her hands, holding everything together while her father fell apart. He paid in advance, 10 silver coins from the treasury, a huge sum. Kathleen hid them and looked at him with suspicion and asked what happened if it didn't work. Daniel said the money was hers regardless. Kathleen blinked. Then she said it would work. On the way back, Halvar intercepted him at the gate. They stepped inside, and the captain closed the door. A messenger had arrived from the south, from Count Wyland Oric, Mournhold's most powerful neighbor. Wealthy, cruel, clever. His lands had bordered Mournhold to the south for years, and for years he had wanted to absorb the northern duchy into his domain. The letter was polite, the seal was official, and behind every courteous phrase was a threat as clear as a drawn blade.
Cassian had borrowed 3,000 gold pieces from Oric 2 years ago for another feast. The payment deadline had passed 6 months before. Under local law, a creditor could send troops into a debtor's land to secure the debt.
6 months until the 1-year deadline expired. Oric could move on Mournhold legally, completely legally. Daniel put the letter down and asked how many soldiers Oric had. Halvar said up to 800 professional mercenaries, trained and armed. Daniel asked how many they had. Halvar said 40 guards, half of whom had never fought a day in their lives. 800 against 40. 6 months. 3,000 gold pieces he didn't have. A body still falling apart. Land just beginning to breathe. He looked at Halvar and asked how much peas cost. Halvar didn't understand the question. Daniel didn't explain it yet. That night, he sat in the office with Oric's letter on the table and ran the math on everything Mournhold had. Land, barely alive. Forest, and the northern foothills. Stone, a river. People, 3,200, who had only just begun to come back to themselves. 2 blacksmiths, 9 carpenters, 3 masons, 1 midwife, 1 bone setter. 0 doctors until Evelyn. 1 brilliant 17-year-old engineer who didn't know she was one. He drew numbers, crossed them out, drew them again. By dawn, he had the answer. Not perfect, not safe, but the only one available.
In the morning, he called a meeting. Rudger, Halvar, Sora. Evelyn came uninvited and sat in the corner.
Lion stood by the door and pretended she wasn't listening. Daniel laid out 3 sheets of parchment, a map of Mournhold, a list of resources, a plan. He began. Mournhold cannot pay Oric with money, but it can create a situation where Oric won't want to invade. Rudger raised an eyebrow. Daniel explained, Oric doesn't need dead land. Occupying a black wasteland means taking on costs, not gaining assets. What Oric needs is the northern trade route, the only road from the southern trading lands to the northern ports, a route Cassian had closed with insane tolls 5 years ago, until the caravans stopped coming entirely. Open the route, make it safe, charge a reasonable toll, 3% per caravan instead of 30. Based on old traffic figures, that was roughly 100 gold pieces a month, 600 in 6 months. Not 3,000, but enough to begin payment, and enough to show Oric that a living Mournhold was more profitable to him than a dead one.
A dead Mournhold is an expense. A living one is a trading partner.
Rudger's gaunt face showed something Daniel had not yet seen from him, something resembling respect.
But who guards the road, Halver asked. 40 guards can't control a territory that size.
Daniel said the villages would. Every village along the route receives the right to collect a transit toll on behalf of the duchy. A third stays with the village. 2/3 goes to the treasury.
A village that guards its section of road guards its income. No soldiers required. Only peasants who have a reason to defend what passes through their fields. Halvar and Rudger exchanged a look. 2 men who had spent 30 years in a system where peasants had no right to any income were hearing the opposite for the first time. Sora's pen never stopped moving. Daniel moved to the second source of income, soap. Evelyn looked up sharply from her corner. He said the soap they were already making from ash and fat could be sold in the capital. In southern cities, soap was a luxury. Plain soap cost a copper coin a bar. If they improved it, added herbs for scent, they could sell it for a silver coin. Evelyn said he had gone completely mad. Who would pay a silver coin for lye? Daniel replied that wealthy women in the capital paid 3 silver coins for a candle that smelled like roses. Soap that smelled like lavender would cost more. Evelyn opened her mouth, closed it, thought about it. Third, salt. A salt spring in the northern foothills. Small and previously ignored, but evaporation methods could extract pure white salt. Expensive in this kingdom, especially from a spring that had just become duchy property by inheritance law, since the baron who owned it had died without heirs. Rudger said to assert the claim. He nodded once, firmly. When everyone left, Lion stepped away from the door and walked to the table. She looked at the map, the numbers, the plan. Then she looked at Daniel and said he didn't look like someone who found all this in a book. He looked like someone who had done this before, many times. Daniel didn't answer. Lion said she didn't care who he was. If he saved these people, she didn't care where he came from. But if this was a performance, if there was cruelty waiting behind it, she wouldn't wait. Daniel looked her in the eyes and said he wasn't lying. The goal was simple. The people of Mournhold must live, not just survive, live. Lian stood for a moment. Then she pulled the knife from her sleeve. Daniel didn't move. She placed it on the table. She said, if he needed a woman who walked the villages alone, who knew every path, whom the peasants trusted, she didn't need a title. She needed one promise, that he would never lay a hand on the children. I promise. Lian took the knife. She left, but she didn't hide it back in her sleeve. She tucked it openly into her belt. A knife in a sleeve is for a stab in the back. A knife on a belt is for defense. Daniel noticed the difference and said nothing. Work on the northern road began 3 days later. 20 men cutting bushes, filling pits. Slow work, but it was getting done. On the 3rd day, a boy ran in from the village of Calmer, gasping. Strangers had come, 5 on horseback in the colors of Count Oric. They hadn't attacked. They hadn't threatened. They had ridden slowly through the village, looked around, counted the houses, counted the people, and left. Daniel sent the boy back with a sack of grain. then called Halvar.
Oric had sent a reconnaissance party. Halvar nodded. He'd been expecting it. He said this was the beginning. First scouts, then provocations. A poisoned well, a burned barn, a traveler killed on the road, then mercenaries at the border, then war.
Daniel asked how long they had.
Halvar said Oric was cautious. He would apply pressure slowly, 2 or 3 months until the first sabotage, 4 until open conflict, which matched the deadline exactly.
Daniel stood there and laid it out in his head. 4 months to bring in a harvest, open the trade route, start paying the debt, and create something worth fighting for. Something that would make 300 peasants take up arms and defend land they had considered cursed just a month before.
He told Halvar he needed an army.
Halvar snorted. An army costs money.
Daniel said he didn't need an army that cost money. He needed one that would defend their home. Every village along the route forms a unit of 10. The guards train them not to fight, to defend. Lookouts in the forest, patrols, signal fires. If one village is attacked, neighboring villages see the signal and come. A militia. People defending their fields, their children, their clean wells, their peas.
Halvar stood very still. Then he asked quietly, "My lord, do you understand what you are doing? You are giving peasants weapons, teaching them to fight, giving them land and a share of the road toll."
If they decide to turn those weapons against you. Daniel cut him off. If he was the kind of duke worth his salt, they wouldn't. And if he became the kind they had to defend themselves against, he'd deserve it.
Halvar looked at him for a long moment. Then he sighed and said, "I obey, my lord," for the first time without adding any objection.
That evening, Daniel sat on the porch steps, tired, sick, trembling hands, aching liver. Fires burned in the courtyard. People sat around them, eating from communal pots.
Children ran between the tables. A boy of about 6 ran up to him and held out a bowl of hot porridge with dried berries.
Daniel took it. The boy smiled a toothless smile and ran off.
Daniel ate the porridge and watched the fires and thought that 3 weeks ago, these people had stood at the gate, afraid even to speak.
The peas sprouted on the 32nd day.
Daniel went out to the test plots at dawn and saw green, thin, pale stems pushing through the black crust. Dozens of them. Hundreds. He dropped to his knees and touched a sprout. Alive. Warm from the morning sun. His throat tightened, not from joy, from relief, because if the earth hadn't responded, in 4 weeks the supplies would have run out, and 3,500 people would have started dying. But now they wouldn't. Sora arrived an hour later. She looked at the sprouts, then at Daniel, then back at the sprouts. She wrote down the date and the height of the shoots. By noon, a crowd had gathered by the plots. Peasants stood staring at the greenery. Some touched the sprouts. An old woman knelt and pressed her palm flat against the earth. She stayed like that for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the castle, and returned an hour later with a small bag of seeds. Not peas, lentils, hidden under her floor for 3 years, guarded like a last possession. She held them out to Daniel. He weighed them in his palm. 200 grams, enough for 1 small plot. But the seeds weren't what mattered. What mattered was that she had given of her own. She had stopped hiding. She had come to believe it was worth planting. Daniel asked her name, Agnes. He wrote it down. Sora entered it in the registry. By the end of the week, 14 families had brought seeds. Turnips, flax, barley, a handful at a time, whatever they had been keeping hidden. People had started planting, not because the Duke ordered it, because they saw that the land was responding. Daniel distributed the seeds among the plots and assigned each one to a family. He explained simple rules. Don't plant the same crop 2 years running in the same spot. Rotate. Peas, then turnips, then barley, then peas again. He called it the cycle of the stars. What he was actually doing was basic crop rotation, second-year agronomy at Cornell. He sat in his office that evening and imagined the expression on Professor Chin's face and felt appropriate shame. While the grass grew in the fields, Kathleen was building the water hammer. The work took 3 weeks. Daniel came every day to check progress and offer suggestions. Kathleen asked questions that made him genuinely think. She wasn't just following the blueprint. She was improving it. She suggested mounting the hammer not on a rigid shaft, but on a flexible joint, so the blow hit harder. Daniel looked at her solution and realized she had invented a hinged mount by feel alone. No textbooks, no theory, just an understanding of how metal behaves under impact. Kathleen's father hadn't appeared the first week. He was inside drinking. She came in every morning with red eyes and said nothing about it. Then one evening, Daniel walked into the smithy and found old Brennan sitting by the cold forge, staring at the drawing of the water hammer on the wall.
His eyes were cloudy, but he was looking at the drawing.
Daniel sat beside him, in silence. They stayed like that for about 10 minutes. Then, Brennan said his wife had loved peas. She planted them every year by the house. When she died, the peas withered, like everything else. Daniel didn't answer.
Brennan said his daughter was running the smithy alone and that he was a lousy father.
Daniel didn't answer that either.
Brennan asked if it was true that the Duke ate from the same pot as the peasants.
Daniel said it was. Brennan sat with that for a moment. Then he stood and walked to the forge and began to stoke it. His hands shook, but he stoked the fire.
Daniel left. The next morning, Brennan stood at the anvil beside his daughter. Kathleen saw Daniel and smiled, freckles glowing, and said nothing. Daniel understood.
The water hammer ran for the first time on the 26th day.
The wheel stood on a diversion channel from the aqueduct. Water turned it slowly and with enormous power. The shaft lifted a 60-pound hammer. The hammer fell onto the anvil with a crash that made the ground tremble.
One blow every 3 seconds, without pause, without fatigue. As long as the water flows, the hammer strikes.
Kathleen stood watching with a face people wear when they witness a miracle. Brennan stood behind her, sober, quiet, with tearful eyes. He wasn't looking at the hammer. He was looking at his daughter. A crowd had gathered. Blacksmiths from distant villages had come to see it. An old blacksmith from Torenheim sat down on the ground and stayed there for a long time. Then he stood, walked to Daniel, and asked if he could build one in Torenheim. There was a stream there, too. Daniel said yes. Kathleen would draw the plans. Materials at the duchy's expense, labor paid by the village. The old man bowed, not to the Duke, to the hammer. Daniel turned away so no one would see his face. He thought of the windmills in Yemen, built from car parts, the water pumps in Nepal, made from plastic pipes, the boy in Sudan who saw a solar panel work for the first time and stood with his mouth open for half an hour. The same reaction everywhere. When a person sees for the first time that water and wind and fire can work for them, not just muscle, but force that doesn't get tired, something changes in them permanently. It was for that moment he had once gone into agronomy. Road clearing had expanded from 20 to 40 to 60. People came on their own now, not just for porridge, but for the road. They understood. Not all of them, not fully, but enough. The road is life. Caravans are goods. Goods or money. Money is food in winter. Lion went from village to village explaining the toll scheme. 1/3 to the village, 2/3 to the duchy. She stated the facts without promises of a bright future. The peasants listened with skepticism. 1/3 to the village? In all of Mournhold's history, a village had never received a share of anything.
3 villages agreed the first day. By the end of the week, all 7 villages on the route had joined. Competition worked better than any persuasion.
The first caravan passed through Mournhold 6 weeks after clearing began. 3 carts, fabrics from the south. The merchant traveled with a guard of 10 mercenaries because he didn't believe the route was open, didn't believe the toll was 3%, didn't believe the road was safe.
But he went through. He paid. The village of Calmer received its share, 17 copper coins. Old Beatrice held those coins in her palms and looked at them. Less than a chicken was worth. but it was the first money the village of Calmer had earned in 3 years. Not taken, not lost, earned.
She came to Daniel the next day with a pot of porridge with butter. She set it on the table in the office. She said nothing. She left.
Sora recorded it in the ledger. Received from the village of Calmer, 1 pot.
Daniel asked why she wrote that down. Sora said everything had to be accounted for. Every pot, every name.
He looked at her and nodded. She was right. By the end of the 2nd month, what Daniel had been waiting for and fearing arrived together.
A messenger from the capital, not from Oric, from the Church of the Seven Lights.
The archbishop was sending an inquisitor to Mournhold to examine the duke's spiritual state. Under canon law, the church had the right to examine any noble whose grace index had shifted sharply. A sharp drop signified sin, a sharp rise meant possession.
Both were punishable. Daniel read the letter twice.
Possession. They suspected a demon was inside him.
And by and large, they weren't entirely wrong. He wasn't a demon, but he wasn't Cassian either.
If the Inquisitor discovered that the soul in this body didn't belong to it, that was the stake. Not metaphorical, a real one.
He thought about how, in Yemen, a council of village elders had come to inspect his camp, convinced humanitarian aid was a cover for something darker. He had shown them everything. Every tent, every warehouse, every record.
Transparency had been the best defense. He who hides is guilty. He who shows is free.
He decided to meet the Inquisitor in the field, not in a castle hall with tapestries and gold, but knee-deep in mud, beside the people who worked.
Father Vernon arrived 2 weeks later, tall, gaunt, black cassock, the silver emblem of the 7 lights on his chest, and eyes like 2 gray stones.
In 30 years of service, he had sent 17 people to the stake. All of Valderin knew it.
Vernon rode in through the western gate, and the first thing he saw were children, playing, running, laughing.
He stopped his horse and watched. His reports had said Mournhold was a place where children died.
Sora met him with a notebook and directed him to the fields.
He found Daniel knee-deep in mud, marking out a new plotting plot. He straightened when the horse's shadow fell over him. He said, "Good day, Father Vernon." He took off his gloves and extended a muddy hand.
Vernon did not accept the handshake. He dismounted. He looked at the sprouts and asked what they were. Daniel said, "Peas." Vernon asked why the Duke was planting peas. Daniel said, "Because the people are starving."
Vernon asked since when the Duke of Mournhold had concerned himself with hunger. Daniel said, "Recently."
Vernon didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stood and looked. Then he agreed to a tour.
For 3 days, Daniel showed him everything. The aqueduct, the clinic where Evelyn worked, the school Sora had started in one of the castle rooms, 12 children learning to write their names.
The water hammer, the soap workshop, the road, the village of Calmer, where Beatrice dragged them inside and fed them porridge before they could object. Vernon ate the porridge in silence. He looked at Beatrice's clean hands, at the soap by the door, at the pot of boiled water on the table. On the 3rd evening, he went to the chapel. Daniel found him there an hour later, kneeling before the altar. Not praying, just kneeling. Daniel sat on a bench and waited.
Vernon spoke without turning. He said that in 30 years he had examined hundreds of nobles. Every single one had hidden sins. Every single one had lied. Every single one had tried to buy his silence or frighten him into it.
But this duke had led him into a field and shown him peas.
A long pause. Then Vernon said he did not know who was living in Cassian von Mournhold's body. Daniel went completely still.
Vernon turned. His gray eyes looked straight at him. He said, "The Cassian I knew from the reports could not have become this man. People do not change like that. Not in a month, not in a year, not in a lifetime."
So this was not Cassian. Daniel sat motionless. His heart was loud.
Vernon said that according to canon, he was required to declare possession, call the garrison, arrest, burn.
The pause that followed lasted an eternity.
Then Vernon said that according to canon, he was also required to protect the innocent, and in 3 days, he had seen more innocent people protected than in 30 years of service.
He rose from his knees. He approached Daniel. He said his report to the archbishop would read as follows. Duke Cassian von Mournhold had undergone a spiritual rebirth. The grace of the lights had touched his heart and set him on the path of service. The grace index is rising. There is no threat. The verification is complete.
Daniel exhaled.
Vernon raised one finger. He said this was not a gift. It was a duty. He would return in 1 year. If he saw that all of this had been a lie, he would burn it himself.
Daniel nodded. Vernon walked to the door, stopped at the threshold, and, without turning, said quietly,
"Whoever you are, carry on."
He laughed. Daniel sat in the empty chapel with shaking hands. The Inquisitor, who had burned 17 people, had looked straight through him and closed his eyes anyway, because of the peas, because of the boiling water, because of children playing.
He leaned forward and buried his face in his hands.
The first attack came a week after Vernon's departure. The village of Calmer. 3 hours before dawn, someone set fire to the grain barn, the month's supplies Daniel had allocated to the village. It burned to the ground in an hour.
No one saw the arsonist, only the smell of oil on the charred boards.
Daniel rode to Calmer. Cassian's body screamed at every step on horseback. He endured it. Beatrice stood by the ruin of the barn. She wasn't crying. Peasants stood around her with faces Daniel recognized too well from fieldwork. Hopelessness. Why build? Why believe? They'll burn it anyway. It doesn't matter.
Daniel dismounted and walked to her. He asked if everyone was alive. She nodded. He said the grain would come tomorrow. A new barn in a week, only this time stone, with a lock.
Beatrice said she was a foolish old woman. She had believed him. She should have hidden the grain under the floor like before.
Daniel replied, "Hiding grain under the floor isn't a life. Life is when the grain stands in the barn and no one dares touch it." He said they would make that happen.
He walked through the village and examined the damage. Oil. Arson. Not bandits. Bandits loot. They don't burn.
This was sabotage, a message from Oric. I can reach you whenever I want.
Back at the castle, Halvar spread a map on the table and pointed out the vulnerabilities. Villages on the border, bridges, barns, wells. 1,000 ways to make life unbearable without crossing with an army.
Daniel looked at the map and thought, he couldn't post a guard at every barn, but he didn't need to control the territory. He needed the territory to control itself.
He started in Calmer. He gathered the village, 32 people, men, women, elderly, teenagers, and asked for 10 volunteers willing to stand night watch in pairs, patrolling and watching the roads.
If they saw strangers, they light a signal fire on the hill. The neighboring village sees it and sends help. Silence. Then a hand went up. A young man of about 20, tall, thin with big hands. Marcus.
A woman rose behind him. Ada, mother of 3, whose husband had died of fever. Then another. Within 10 minutes, 14 volunteers.
Daniel left Halvar to train them. The basics. How to patrol, how to signal, how to hide, and crucially, if you see a professional soldier, don't engage. Run, shout, light the fire. Their job wasn't to fight. Their job was to warn.
In 2 weeks, Daniel visited every village along the border. 7 patrols in 7 villages, 70 people linked by signal fires.
1 village burning. The whole south of Mournhold knows within 15 minutes.
Halvar trained them silently and grimly, but he trained them, and Daniel noticed the captain was changing. He looked at the peasants not as cattle anymore, as recruits. Bad ones, weak ones, untrained, but recruits.
One evening after training, Halvar said the lad Marcus from Calmer was not bad, fast, attentive, could be made into a squad leader.
Daniel said, "Do it," Halvar snorted, a squad leader out of a peasant. He would have been laughed at for that 30 years ago, and went and did it.
He started training Marcus separately in the evenings. Daniel saw it and said nothing. He didn't need to.
The second attack came 10 days later. 3 horsemen tried to burn the bridge over the stream at Torenheim at night, the bridge every caravan used.
A sentry spotted them. He lit the fire. 5 minutes later, the whole village was up. The arsonists rode off. The bridge stood intact.
Daniel arrived in the morning. The sentry's name was Oric, 17 years old, with protruding ears and a face that seemed permanently startled.
He sat on a bench trembling. His first duty. He had seen the men with torches, and his hands had shaken so badly he'd failed to strike a spark 4 times before the 5th try caught.
Daniel sat beside him and asked if he had been afraid. Oric said he had nearly wet himself.
Daniel said, "That's normal. What matters isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do when you're afraid." Oric had lit the fire on the 5th try, but he lit it.
The bridge stood. The village stood. Oric looked at him, and something new appeared on his face. Not pride yet, but the beginning of it.
Back at the castle, Sora was waiting with the trade figures. A second caravan had passed, a third, a fourth. Merchants were telling each other the northern route was open, the toll was low, the road was guarded.
Monthly revenue, 87 silver coins. Not the 100 gold pieces he had projected, but it was growing.
Soap production was scaling up under Evelyn. 3 cauldrons, lavender and mint from the foothills added to each batch. The first 200 bars went south with a caravan as samples. The merchant had turned pale at Evelyn's promise of what would happen if he didn't pay, and promised to pay.
The salt spring yielded its first 20 pounds of pure white salt. Small, but the evaporation pans were expanding. 100 pounds by end of month, 300 the month after.
Daniel and Sora pored over numbers every evening. 3,000 gold owed to Oric. 4 months left. At current rate, they'd have 300 gold saved by the deadline.
A tenth of the debt. Not enough to pay it off, but enough to demonstrate solvency. Mournhold is paying. Mournhold is functioning. Invading a functioning duchy isn't debt collection, it's seizure. Different things in the eyes of the crown.
He wrote a letter to Oric. He acknowledged the debt. Enclosed 50 gold pieces as a first installment. Invited the Count to visit Mournhold and see the changes. Proposed discussing terms.
Halvar read the letter and said Daniel had invited a wolf into the henhouse.
Daniel sent it anyway. 2 months had passed. Time to bury the peas. The 6 of them went out to the plots. Daniel, Sora, 2 workers, Lion, who appeared without explanation holding a shovel, and Kathleen, who wanted to see how it was done.
Daniel cut the stems and began working the green mass into the soil. The workers watched in silent horror. They were burying food, living green peas into the ground.
One of them whispered to the other that the Duke had finally lost his mind. Lion heard it and gave the man a look that silenced him for the rest of the day.
Daniel explained as he worked. The plants had drawn strength from the air and stored it in their stems and roots. Now that energy would return to the earth. In a month, this soil would be dark, loose, alive. He called it a gift from the stars to the earth. Privately, he called it green manure and felt appropriate guilt about what Professor Chen would say. They dug all 3 plots in a day. When Daniel squeezed a fist of the turned earth, it felt different already. Not dead, not alive, but awakening. He thought of Yemen, the field near Aden where they had buried their first batch of green manure, and the locals thought he was insane. 6 months later, barley was growing there. Old Farmer Ahmed stood among the grain and wept. 30 years of dead soil, and now ears of barley.
Daniel hoped it would be the same here.
3 days later, Oric sent a representative.
Sir Gilbert arrived with 20 horsemen and the expression of a man appraising merchandise. Well-groomed beard, cold eyes, rich clothes worn to impress.
Daniel met him in clean clothes and a ducal cloak. No rings. He had removed Cassian's rings in the first week.
Because Gilbert was not Vernon, who needed to be disarmed with honesty. Gilbert was a wolf who needed to see that the henhouse had teeth.
They sat in the small hall. Roger served wine. Daniel didn't touch his. Gilbert began with pleasantries. Count Oric sends his regards. The Count is pleased the Duke remembers the debt. The 50 gold pieces have been received.
Pause. At this rate, the debt will be repaid in 5 years. The Count does not have 5 years.
The Count offers an alternative. Instead of cash payment, transfer control of the northern trade route to the Count entirely, all tolls going to Oric until the debt is fully repaid, which by his calculations would take 2.5 years.
After that, control returns to Mournhold. Very reasonable, very polite.
Daniel was silent and calculated. 2.5 years of tolls from that road was roughly 4,000 gold, more than the debt by a third.
Oric didn't want money. He wanted the route, because whoever controls the route controls trade, and whoever controls trade controls Mournhold.
In 2.5 years, he would formally return the road, but by then, every caravan would follow his rules, every merchant would be his client, every village along the route would depend on him.
Clever. Extremely clever.
Daniel thanked the Count for the offer, said he would think it over and needed a week. Gilbert nodded and left.
Lion came in a minute later. She had been by the door. She always was.
She said, if they give up the road, in a year, Mournhold belongs to Oric, without a single soldier, without a single sword stroke, just through money.
Daniel nodded. He knew. He said he was going to refuse.
Lion asked, and then? Then Oric said, then Oric gets angry and speeds up, which means they don't have 4 months. They have 2, maybe 3.
Leone stood thinking. Then she said she knew people in Oric's lands, peasants who were also starving, who had heard of Mournhold, who were already fleeing when they could.
Every refugee from Oric's lands was one less worker for Oric, and one more from Mournhold. What if instead of simply receiving those who came, they made sure people knew Mournhold was open?
Daniel said it was dangerous. Poaching serfs from a neighboring lord was grounds for war.
Lion said she wasn't talking about calling anyone, just being a place people came to on their own, and not closing the gates.
Daniel said, the gates remain open, just as they are.
He wrote the refusal to Oric that evening, polite, grateful, firm. He enclosed another 30 gold pieces. A messenger carried it south.
Daniel knew it wouldn't be a messenger returning. A sword would.
2 weeks of silence. Not a single sabotage attempt. Not a single scout at the border.
Halvar said silence was worse than attacks. When the enemy goes quiet, they're preparing something final.
Daniel used every day. The militia trained. Halvar pushed them. Not cruelly, hard. Running, drill, spears, bows, ambushes in the forest paths.
Marcus from Calmer was a squad leader now, commanding 10 men. The young man who had been rummaging through trash at the castle gates 3 months ago walked with his back straight and gave orders. His voice still trembled sometimes, but the orders were right.
Daniel built no walls. Walls took too long. He built embankments, ditches, and roadblocks instead. He had studied the terrain and found 3 narrow passes through which an army could enter from the south. Everything else was forest and swamp, impassable for cavalry.
Oric would come through those passes. Daniel set up roadblocks at each one, fallen trees, trenches 1.5 men deep, sharpened stakes at the bottom.
Not to stop the army, to slow it down, to force cavalry to dismount. A mounted mercenary is terrifying. The same man on foot, in an unfamiliar forest, among ditches and ambushes, is just a man with a sword.
Kathleen was forging arrowheads on the water hammer, 100 a day. Brennan worked beside her, sober, steady, and the ring of 2 hammers mixed with the roar of the water wheel.
Daniel watched them and thought, this is the army. Not soldiers, people who have something to defend. People with clean water, hot porridge, children in school, and names recorded in a registry.
People who for the first time in years did not consider themselves cattle. People like that fight differently. At the end of the 3rd month, Daniel declared a feast.
No harvest yet. The green manure crops had only just begun returning to the soil what they had taken from the air. But in Mournhold, for the first time in 3 years, no one was starving. No one was dying of fever. The children went to school.
23 students. Sora taught letters and numbers in the evenings. 5 caravans had passed in the last month. Water flowed through the aqueduct. Soap was being made. Salt was being evaporated. The trade route was open.
The people deserved one day when they didn't have to work, when they could simply sit and eat and look at one another.
Long tables were set up in the castle courtyard, planks on trestles, no division by class. Guards sat beside peasants. Rudger sat beside the blacksmith from Torenheim. Evelyn sat beside the mothers whose children she had saved.
Lion sat alone in a corner, but she was sitting, not standing by the door, not hiding, sitting.
Daniel served the soup himself, a large ladle, hot broth with vegetables and grain. Simple food, hot and plentiful. People ate in silence at first. Then someone spoke. Then someone laughed. Then someone began softly singing an old song, and others joined. A song about a river that had dried up and started flowing again.
Daniel served the soup and listened to words he didn't know, a melody he somehow already remembered.
A boy ran up, about 6 years old, toothless smile, bowl extended. Daniel froze.
He recognized this boy from Cassian's memories. A whip, an apple on the stone floor, a scream. He had thought the boy had died.
But the boy was alive, standing right here, smiling.
And then Daniel understood something about the memory. Cassian's guilty conscience had made it worse than it was, because even a monster knew that beating a child over an apple was monstrous, and memory had punished him more severely than reality.
The boy said, "Thank you, Uncle Duke."
Daniel poured him some soup. His hand didn't tremble.
The boy took the bowl and ran off to the other children. Daniel said something under his breath, stepped behind a column, leaned his back against the cold stone, and cried.
Not loudly, not sobbing, quietly, the way grown men cry who have seen too much and held on for too long.
The tears ran for about 10 minutes. He didn't wipe them away. Footsteps, light, almost silent.
She stopped beside him, didn't say a word, didn't touch him, just stood there.
Daniel wiped his face with a sleeve and looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the courtyard where the people were eating and singing.
Her face was unreadable, but she was standing there beside him, and that was enough.
The celebration ended by nightfall. People left slowly, not wanting to go. Sora came and sat beside him on the steps.
She was holding a notebook. She always held a notebook. She said she wanted to ask him something, not as the treasurer, as a person.
Daniel nodded.
Sora said she was doing the math. That was her job, and the numbers didn't add up.
A man who 3 months ago was Cassian von Mournhold could not possibly know what he knew. Not from books. Books don't teach you to make children drink salt water. Books don't teach you to build water hammers, or organize a census, or design the economics of a trade route. This is knowledge from experience, from years of work. Cassian didn't have that. So it isn't Cassian. Daniel was silent.
I don't care. I don't care who you were, because I see who you are now. A man who stays up all night so the children can eat, who counts every coin, who knows every patient in the clinic by name.
That is enough for me. But I want to know one thing. Will you stay? Or will you leave one day? Because if he left, everything he had built would come crashing down, and she wanted to know so she could be prepared.
Daniel looked at this small woman in a worn dress with rock crystal glasses, at the ducal seal he had given her a month ago that she wore on a string around her neck, at the notebook in which every life in Mournhold was recorded.
He said he wouldn't leave. Sora nodded. She stood.
She left.
He watched her go and knew he had lied. Not on purpose, but he didn't know the rules of this world. He didn't know if he could die and wake up back on the plain.
But he said he would stay because Sora didn't deserve any other answer. The morning after the celebration, bad news arrived.
3 peasants killed on the eastern road. Bodies found in a ditch, throats slit. A note on the bodies. 1 word. Debt.
Halvar placed the note on the table in front of Daniel. 1 word on dirty parchment.
Daniel stared at it. 3 people killed. People with names in Sora's registry. People who had been at the tables the night before, eating soup and singing about a river starting to flow again.
Halvar was silent. He waited. Daniel asked, "Were they in the militia?" Halvar said no. Ordinary peasants going to market. Unarmed. Not dangerous.
Killed not in battle. Killed as a message.
Daniel stood and walked to the window. The ground outside was no longer entirely black. Green patches breaking through here and there. Young grass, shoots, life.
And on the road, 3 bodies with their throats slit. He turned to Halvar and said he needed names. Halvar raised an eyebrow. Oric's mercenaries don't leave calling cards.
Daniel said he didn't need calling cards. He needed Lion.
She arrived within the hour, he explained. She listened. Her face didn't change. Then she said she had people in Oric's lands, not spies, just peasants who watched what was going on, who knew the mercenaries by sight.
She could find out who it was.
Daniel said, find out, but not for revenge, for proof.
If he could prove that Oric had sent assassins into Mournhold during peacetime, that was a violation of royal law, an argument he could bring before the crown. Lion looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she said that in her experience, evidence worked worse than a knife to the throat.
Daniel replied, a knife to the throat works only once. Evidence works forever.
She returned 5 days later with names. 2 mercenaries, Greg Hartley and Vincent Moss, last seen leaving Oric's castle 3 days before the murder.
Daniel summoned Rudger and dictated an official complaint to the royal marshal. Names, dates, descriptions. Rudger wrote in perfect handwriting, with a face like carved wood. When he finished, he looked at Daniel and said, "This was the first time in 30 years that the Duke of Mournhold had filed a complaint to protect his peasants."
Usually, complaints were filed against the Duke.
The complaint went by messenger. Daniel knew the reply would be slow, might not come at all, but the document existed. It was on record. If Oric invaded, it wouldn't be debt collection. It would be an attack on a duchy that had turned to the crown for protection.
The difference between those 2 things could cost Oric his head.
It might not, but it might.
While Daniel waited, a woman appeared at the western gate at dawn, barefoot, in a gray habit without any religious insignia, a canvas bag on her shoulder.
The guards wouldn't let her through. Halvar came. The woman said she was a former nun of the Church of the 7 Lights, excommunicated for heresy. She had walked 3 weeks from the capital. She had heard they were teaching peasant children to read and wanted to see it with her own eyes.
Halvar brought her to Daniel. Her name was Mir Chu. Tall, calm, gray eyes that held only curiosity.
Daniel asked what heresy she had been excommunicated for. She said she had taught peasant girls to read. He paused and asked if that was heresy. She said, in the Archbishop's opinion, literacy for women of the lower classes undermined the world order. A peasant woman's place was by the hearth. She had no need for letters. Daniel thought he had heard that argument before, from the Taliban, from warlords in Somalia, from village elders in Nepal. Different languages, same meaning. Those who cannot read do not ask questions. He asked if she knew how to teach. She said she had taught novices in the convent for 12 years. Literacy, arithmetic, history, botany. He said he needed a real school, not one room in the evening, a school with a schedule and a teacher who did nothing else. For everyone, boys and girls, children and adults, anyone who wanted to learn. Mir looked at him for a moment and asked if he understood what that meant. An educated peasant is a dangerous peasant. One who reads, understands the law, understands his rights, starts asking questions. Uncomfortable questions for any lord, including this one.
Daniel said, "That is exactly what I am counting on."
Mir blinked. A look of genuine surprise crossed her face. Then she said, "All right, where is my room?"
She and Sora were made from the same cloth, both neat, both meticulous, both believing in the power of the written word. By end of their first day together, they had a 3-month curriculum: literacy, counting to 100, basic hygiene, and the rights of a peasant under Valderin law. Mir had added that last item herself. Daniel read the plan and didn't cross it out.
The school opened a week later in a renovated barn near the castle walls. Plank benches, a blackboard of planed black oak, chalk.
23 children, ages 6 to 14, and 11 adults. Among them, Marcus, militia corporal, commander of men, who couldn't write his own name. He sat on a bench beside a 6-year-old girl and traced the letters just as carefully as she did. Mir taught without shouting, without punishment. Every student at their own pace. When a boy named Thomas wrote his full name for the first time, he stared at the letters on the board as if he couldn't believe they were real. His name, written down, existing, not just a sound that disappears, letters that remain. He turned to his mother at the door. She pressed her hand to her lips. Mir went to Daniel that evening and said she needed more chalk, more boards, more material, and another teacher. Daniel said parchment was expensive. Mir said she knew a recipe for cheap writing material from straw and water. A long process, rough result, but writable. She described it: straw soaked, broken into fibers, mixed with water, spread thin on a frame, dried. A rough gray sheet, uneven, but you could write on it. Daniel listened. She was describing primitive papermaking, a Chinese method 1,000 years old. Here, a complete novelty. He told her, "Go ahead." A week later, the first sheets of homemade paper appeared at the school. Rough, gray, smudged by charcoal, but it was paper, Mournhold's paper, made by Mournhold's people. Mir brought a sheet to Daniel. He held it to the light and felt the coarse fibers. In his world, a defect. Here, a miracle. He told her she had just changed Mournhold more than the water hammer and the aqueduct combined.
Mir raised an eyebrow and asked why.
Daniel said, "The hammer makes iron, paper makes thoughts, and thoughts are stronger." Mir looked at him. Then she said politely that for 20 years she had been searching for God in monasteries, in books, in prayers, and wandering. And it turns out he just boils water and plants peas. Daniel said, "God is probably the one who decided to boil." Mir didn't answer, but the corners of her mouth moved, almost a smile, the first in a long time. And in the corner of a castle that 3 months ago had been the most hated place in the duchy, something was growing that no one had yet found a name for. Not yet, but it was there. The barley sprouted on the 12th day, thin green needles pushing through dark earth in even rows, healthy and thick, no yellow spots. Daniel knelt at the edge of the plot and touched a stem. Sturdy, good root system. He knew from 10 years in the field, if sprouts look like this on day 12, there will be a harvest. The news spread within a day. Peasants walked from distant villages to stand at the edge of the field, green, on the black soil of Mournhold. An old man from Torenheim walked 8 miles to see it. He stood for an hour. Then he left in silence. He returned the next day with 5 bags of oats, hidden in his attic for 7 years, since before the gray drought. He had saved them without knowing why. Now he knew. Others brought seeds, a handful here, a small bag there, turnips, flax, barley, whatever they had kept hidden. By the end of the 4th month, 22 plots had been sown across Mournhold, roughly 100 acres. Not much for a duchy, but 3 months ago there had been nothing. From the top of the castle tower, the land looked like a disease in reverse, patches of green emerging from the black plain, as if someone were healing the earth, plot by plot, field by field, because that was exactly what was happening. Then the earth did something that had no agronomy behind it.
In the middle of the night, Daniel woke to a strange sensation, the floor vibrating, a low hum beneath the stone, as if something enormous were moving deep below.
He went to the courtyard and stood barefoot on the stones and felt it through his soles. Then the sound stopped. The next morning, news came from Calmer. The well had overflowed overnight. Clean, cold water gushing from the ground like a spring, water that hadn't been there since before the drought. Similar reports from Torenheim. The stream feeding the water hammer had doubled overnight. The salt spring in the foothills was flowing 3 times as strong.
Daniel stood with Lion at the top of the tower and thought about what he had read in Cassian's memories of this world's magic, grace tied to public recognition, ancestral artifacts responding to the sincerity of those who lived on the land.
3,000 people who for the first time in years were eating their fill. Children not dying, clean water flowing, a school, soap, paper, names recorded. Maybe the land sensed all of it. Maybe the land was the artifact. Leon said Oric's reconnaissance had stopped completely. Not a single horseman at the border in 10 days. She said that was more frightening than daily patrols. It meant a decision had been made.
Daniel came down from the tower and sat with the map. 3 passes from the south, fortified. A militia of 110 men plus 40 guards, 150 against 800.
1 to 5. In open country, suicide. But they would not be in open country. Every rock, every trail, every stream would work for them. That was their only advantage. He had the plan laid out. Marcus and 30 men at the widest southern pass, ambushes, archers on the hills. Goal not to stop the army, but to slow it, force cavalry down. Halvar himself at the western pass, 10 men at the narrow eastern one, the rest in reserve.
Women, children, and the elderly would retreat to the castle at the first signal fire. 3 fires, 1 at each pass. When one lit, everyone would know which way the enemy was coming.
He looked at the plan and saw every gap. If Oric found a path through the forest, if a traitor opened a passage, if the militiamen broke at the sight of professional soldiers. Every if meant bodies. He had been here before, in Sudan, evacuating 30,000 people on a 40-page plan that fell apart within the first 20 minutes, because a plan cannot withstand contact with reality.
Only preparation can. People who know what to do, who have trained, who trust each other, who understand why. He had those people now. He hoped it was enough. Then a second threat arrived from a direction he hadn't fully expected. A note slipped under the gate at night. No seal, no signature. 4 words on a dirty sheet. The Duchess knows everything.
Cassian's mother, Duchess Adeline von Mournhold, living in the capital at court. She had left Mournhold 10 years ago and never returned, never written, never asked. Cold, domineering, intelligent, and with a younger son, Leonard, 12 years old, whom she had always preferred. Lion turned pale when she saw the note. She said, "Oric is as dangerous as a wolf. Adeline is as dangerous as poison." Then she said something quietly, almost reluctantly, that changed everything. There were rumors, old servants' whispers, that Cassian hadn't died from the wine, that the wine had been poisoned, that his mother had poisoned him.
To put the younger one on the throne. Gentle, controllable, obedient.
Daniel sat motionless. So Cassian had been murdered by his own mother. That explained it. The wine, the suffocation, the death, the stranger's soul that stepped into an empty body. Adeline had killed her son to make room for Leonard. But instead of a dead Cassian, she got Daniel, who got up in the morning and started boiling water. And now she knew something had gone wrong.
The man in her son's body wasn't her son, and she was going to find out what he was.
One more threat, one more front. Oric with 800 swords in the south. The church's eye watching. A mother who had already killed once, and a duchy just barely learning to breathe.
A week later, a woman arrived at the western gate at dawn, young, blonde, dressed as a pilgrim. She called herself Sister Alba. She wanted an audience to see the famous reforms.
Leon intercepted her first. She came to Daniel and said the woman was lying. Her posture was too straight, her hands too clean. The fabric under her simple cloak was silk.
Pilgrims do not wear silk under canvas. Daniel ordered her brought in, and when the woman entered the office, he recognized her from Cassian's memories. Not from the memories directly, but from coins.
The profile on Valderan's silver coins, Princess Adelaide, heir to the throne, 24 years old, here in Mournhold, in disguise.
He offered her a seat and water. She took the mug, sipped, and said the water was clean. Daniel said yes, boiled.
Adelaide was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "At the palace, the water came from a silver pitcher, and it was worse." Daniel replied that silver doesn't purify water, temperature does.
Adelaide raised an eyebrow. The pilgrim's mask cracked just enough to show the sharp mind underneath.
For 3 days, he guided her through Mournhold differently than he had shown Vernon. To Vernon, he had shown the result. To Adelaide, he showed the process. Not just the aqueduct, how it was built. Not just the school, how Mir teaches. Not just the militia, how Marcus had become what he was. She listened, she watched, she asked questions that were smart, precise, and political. Crop yield, tax base, literacy percentages, the toll distribution mechanism.
She wrote everything in a small notebook with small, neat handwriting.
On the second day, they watched Thomas write his first complete sentence. "My name is Thomas, and I live in Mournhold." Something moved across Adelaide's face, quick, barely visible. But Daniel saw it.
On the third evening, they sat in Evelyn's garden, a small patch of lavender, mint, and chamomile among the stones, and Adelaide was quiet for a long time.
Then she said her father would send an army to defend Mournhold if he knew what was happening here.
Daniel replied, "He knows. Kings always know. They wait for the situation to become clear." He didn't blame the king for that. Politics requires clarity.
He only asked that clarity arrived before Oric burned down what they had built. Then he asked her something, not as a duke, as a man. What did she want? Not as a princess, as a 24-year-old.
The silence stretched for almost a full minute. Then she whispered, "To plant a tree one day and watch it grow."
Daniel stood up and told her to wait. He returned 10 minutes later holding an apple tree sapling. Small, 3 leaves, grown from a seed by Evelyn for the garden. He handed it to her. She looked at it, looked at him, looked back at it. Then she took it.
He showed her where to dig. Adelaide dug in a silk dress under a canvas raincoat. Hands that tomorrow would sign royal decrees were in the earth today. She planted it, she watered it. She stood and looked at the small tree in the ground.
Daniel said the apple tree would bear fruit in 3 years. Adelaide asked if Mournhold would still exist in 3 years.
Daniel said he would do everything to make sure it would.
She left at dawn without a goodbye, without promises, but on the table in her room, she left a rolled parchment with a royal seal.
Daniel unrolled it, read it, called Rudger. Rudger read it. His gaunt face twitched. For the first time in all those months, something moved beneath it. A royal moratorium on debt collection, 1 year, signed by Princess Adelaide on behalf of the crown. Legally flawless. Oric could not invade on the grounds of debt. Not now, not for a year.
She had given them a year.
But a moratorium does not stop a wolf. It only slows him.
A week after Adelaide's departure, Oric's letter arrived. A light. Icy. He acknowledged the moratorium. He respected the will of the crown.
But he had other claims. A land dispute. A patch of border forest in the southwest, on some maps belonging to Mournhold, on others to the county. A trifle dormant for 200 years.
Oric had dug up old documents and was demanding a border revision. Under law, that let him send in a detachment, 50 men, maybe 100, to formally secure the disputed territory.
Rudger explained, formally a border guard, in reality a bridgehead, a foothold inside Mournhold from which pressure could be applied slowly and methodically. Daniel recognized the playbook: Russian peacekeepers in South Ossetia, Turkish observation posts in Syria. Same game, different century. He could not allow Oric's men on Mournhold territory. Even 50 mercenaries in that forest would mean the end. Intercepted caravans, intimidated peasants, everything dismantled from the inside. He had to resolve the land dispute before Oric moved his pieces. He had no lawyer, no knowledge of local law, no 200-year-old maps. He summoned Mir. She had spent 12 years in a convent, whose library held copies of all of Valderan's land registers. She wasn't a lawyer, she said, but she knew how to read old documents.
And in Cassian's castle library, unopened for 20 years, thick with dust, the necessary papers might be waiting.
They went in together and began to look.
Outside, the fields were green. The soap workshop ran 3 cauldrons. Salt pans expanded in the foothills. The militia trained every morning. Marcus walked straight-backed and gave orders in a steady voice, and his men listened because they respected him, not because they feared him. Kathleen had finished the second water hammer for Tornheim. When the hammer struck for the first time, the old blacksmith who had brought the oat seeds took off his hat and bowed to Kathleen, a 17-year-old girl with freckles and burned forearms, and she blushed so red the freckles disappeared before she stood straight and nodded like a master.
Brennan stood nearby with a clean apron and gleaming tools, watching his daughter with the expression fathers wear when they realize their child has surpassed them. And in the school, Marcus sat beside a 6-year-old girl and traced letters he had never known before, his big hands careful on the rough gray paper that Mournhold had made from its own straw.
3,000 people who had been left to die were alive, were fed, were learning to read, were defending their roads, were planting their fields. They had done this with no money, no army, no allies, only arithmetic, clean water, soil, and seeds. A knife moved to a belt, a hammer that worked while the river flowed. There were still threats on every side. Oric's sword, Adeline's poison, the church's eye. The land disputes still unresolved, the old documents still unread. The fight was far from over, but the ground beneath Mournhold was no longer dead. Worms moved through the soil. Barley pushed through in even rows. A small apple tree stood in Evelyn's garden, planted by a princess who had never held a shovel before in her life. A boy named Redhead had died without anyone knowing his real name, but the boy who called Daniel Uncle Duke was running between the tables at the feast, and the world had not ended. And in the castle library, a former nun and a man who was not who he appeared to be were going through 200-year-old records in candlelight, looking for one line in one document that might keep Oric's boots off Mournhold's soil one more day.
One more day was all it ever was. In South Sudan, in Yemen, in Nepal. One more day, then another, until the harvest came in or the plane landed, or the wells started flowing again.
Daniel had learned that a long time ago, in a world far from this one, you don't save everyone. You save who you can save today. And tomorrow, you get up and you do it again.
Outside the window, the land was green in patches, black in others, and still healing. The man who had woken up in a monster's body had not erased what Cassian had done. He could not give back the 12,000 who had fled or died,
could not return the mother Lion had lost, could not unscar the back of the woman who now ran his clinic.
But he had buried the dead girl with dignity on the first day. He had given the next one a name. He had taught the one after that to write hers.
And Mournhold, which had been written off and forgotten by the crown, which had been called a wasteland and a lost cause and a place where children simply died, Mournhold was breathing now.
Not healed, not saved, not finished, but breathing.
Which was more than it had been when he opened his eyes to those blackened beams and the smell of sour wine and put his feet on the cold stone floor of a life that was not his.
He had come with no plan for this world, no allies, no resources, nothing but 10 years of field experience and the stubborn certainty that a person with the right knowledge, even alone, even sick, even in a body that was falling apart, could start something that mattered.
He had been right. The peas had sprouted. The water flowed. The hammer struck without tiring.
And somewhere in the courtyard below, children who 3 months ago had been dying at the gate were playing in the shadow of the castle walls, loud and careless, and completely unaware that they were supposed to be dead.
That was the victory. Not defeating Oric, not outwitting Adelaide, not convincing Vernon. The victory was the sound of children who did not know they were supposed to be afraid.
Daniel stood at the window of Cassian von Mournhold's office, in Cassian von Mournhold's body, and listened to that sound.
And in the library behind him, candlelight and the turning of old pages and the slow, patient work of people who refused to stop.
The land was not finished healing, but it had decided to try.